The world knew Jimi Hendrix as the man who could make a guitar scream, weep, and explode into flames on stage, but on the night of January 29, 1968, at the Konserthuset in Stockholm, something inside him broke in a way no amplifier could fix. Thousands of fans had packed the venue, their breath fogging the cold Swedish air as they waited for the performance of a lifetime. What they didn't know was that behind the curtain, Jimi stood frozen, his hands trembling against the neck of his white Stratocaster, unable to remember why he had agreed to walk out there at all. The band was tuned, the lights were hot, the crowd was roaring, but somewhere between the dressing room and the stage entrance, Jimi Hendrix had quietly begun to vanish. But what happened in the 18 minutes before he walked off that stage would remain hidden for decades, buried under manager contracts, tour schedules, and the unspoken agreement among those present never to speak of it publicly. Only years later, when a Swedish journalist discovered a reel-to-reel tape recording from that night and a handwritten note in Jimi's own script, did the full weight of that concert begin to reveal itself. It wasn't just a bad night. It wasn't just exhaustion. It was the moment Jimi Hendrix realized he had signed away more than his music. Let's go back to the beginning, to understand how a man who seemed born to hold a guitar could stand on stage and feel like a stranger in his own skin. Jimi's childhood in Seattle was soaked in silence and absence. His mother, Lucille, struggled with addiction and instability, drifting in and out of his life like a song you can't quite remember but never fully forget. His father, Al Hendrix, worked long hours and kept his emotions locked behind a wall of quiet discipline. Jimi learned early that the world didn't owe him anything, that safety was a luxury, and that the only voice he could trust was the one that came through his fingertips when he touched the strings of a borrowed guitar. By the time he was 15, music wasn't just a passion for Jimi. It was survival. It was the only place where the chaos inside him could take shape and make sense. He would sit alone in his small bedroom, the rain tapping against the window, and play until his fingers bled. There were no lessons, no formal training, just an instinct that ran deeper than language. He taught himself to bend notes the way other kids learn to ride bicycles, by falling and getting back up, over and over, until the motion became second nature. When Jimi enlisted in the army in 1961, it wasn't out of patriotism or a desire to serve. It was desperation. He needed structure, a way out, something to hold on to. But even in the rigid world of the 101st Airborne, Jimi remained an outsider. He was discharged after a year, officially due to an ankle injury, but those who served with him later admitted that Jimi never quite fit the mold. He was too gentle, too distracted, too lost in a world of sound that only he could hear. The guitar he smuggled into the barracks became his real uniform, the only identity that ever felt true. After the army, Jimi drifted through the early 1960s playing backup guitar for Little Richard, the Isley Brothers, and dozens of other acts on the Chitlin circuit, a grueling network of venues across the segregated South where black musicians could perform. The pay was low, the conditions were brutal, and the recognition was non-existent. Jimi stood in the shadows, playing perfect riffs behind singers who took all the applause, and slowly a hunger began to grow inside him. Not for fame, exactly, but for the chance to be heard in his own voice, to step out of the background and into the light. And then in 1966, everything changed. Chaz Chandler, the bassist for The Animals, saw Jimi playing at the Café Wa in Greenwich Village and heard something no one else had fully recognized yet, the future of rock and roll. Chaz convinced Jimi to come to London, promising him studios, musicians, and the kind of creative freedom that didn't exist in America for a black guitarist who played the blues like Beethoven on fire. Within months, Jimi was recording Hey Joe and forming the Jimi Hendrix Experience with Mitch Mitchell on drums and Noel Redding on bass. The British music press called him a revelation. Eric Clapton, who was being hailed as God on the London club circuit, came to see Jimi play at a small venue and reportedly left shaken, realizing that the rules of the guitar had just been rewritten. But what looked like a meteoric rise from the outside felt like a trap tightening around Jimi's chest. The contracts he signed in those early London days were standard for the time, which is to say they were designed to benefit everyone except the artist. Management took a percentage, the record label took a percentage, the booking agents took a percentage, and Jimi, the man whose fingers created the sound that sold millions of records, was left with whatever remained after everyone else had been paid. He didn't read the fine print. He didn't have a lawyer. He trusted the people who told him they believed in his music, and he signed his name in blue ink on page after page of documents he barely understood. By 1967, Jimi Hendrix was everywhere. Purple Haze climbed the charts, festivals wanted him, magazines wanted to photograph him, and suddenly the boy from Seattle who used to sleep on friends' couches was being flown across continents to perform in front of crowds that stretched beyond what his eyes could see. The Monterey Pop Festival in June of that year became the moment Jimi Hendrix transformed from musician into myth. He closed his set by kneeling in front of his Stratocaster, dousing it in lighter fluid, and setting it ablaze while feedback screamed through the amplifiers like a dying animal. The crowd went silent, then erupted. Photographers captured the image that would define him forever, Jimi on his knees, flames licking up the neck of his guitar, his face illuminated by fire and something close to ecstasy. But backstage, after the flames had been extinguished and the applause had faded, Jimi sat alone in a folding chair, staring at his hands. A stagehand who was there that night later recalled that Jimi looked exhausted, not physically tired but spiritually drained, like a man who had just performed a ritual he didn't fully believe in anymore. Someone asked him if he was okay, and Jimi just nodded, lit a cigarette, and said nothing. The pressure to repeat that Monterey moment followed Jimi everywhere. Promoters wanted fire, they wanted chaos, they wanted the wild man with the guitar. No one seemed interested in the quieter, more introspective music Jimi was beginning to write, the songs that didn't explode but instead folded inward, exploring loneliness and confusion and the strange weight of being seen by millions of people who didn't actually know you at all. He started showing up late to recording sessions, not out of arrogance but because he couldn't find the energy to pretend anymore. The studio, which had once been his sanctuary, began to feel like another stage where he was expected to perform a version of himself that no longer fit. And then there were the pills. In the late 1960s, the line between recreational drug use and something darker was blurry at best, and for touring musicians, pills were as common as guitar picks. Uppers to get you through the show, downers to help you sleep on the bus, something in between to smooth out the edges of constant travel and noise and expectation. Jimi wasn't unique in this, but his relationship with substances was different. He didn't take pills to party. He took them to disappear, to quiet the noise inside his head, to find a few hours where he didn't have to be Jimi Hendrix the icon and could just be a tired kid from Seattle who missed his mother. By the time the European tour rolled around in early 1968, Jimi was running on fumes. The tour schedule was relentless: Paris, Stockholm, Copenhagen, Gothenburg, back to London, then across to Germany, then back again. There were no days off, no time to write, no time to rest. Every night was another sold-out venue, another crowd demanding the hits, another performance where Jimi had to summon the energy to be larger than life even when he felt smaller than ever. And then came Stockholm. The Konserthuset, January 29, 1968. The venue was elegant, more suited to orchestras than rock bands, with high ceilings and wooden acoustics that made every note ring out with almost cathedral-like clarity. The Swedish audience was reserved compared to the wild crowds in London or San Francisco, more likely to sit and listen than to scream and dance. Jimi liked that about European audiences sometimes, the way they treated music like something sacred, but that night the quiet felt oppressive, like a weight pressing down on his chest. In the dressing room before the show, Mitch and Noel were tuning their instruments, joking about the cold, sharing a bottle of something to take the edge off. Jimi sat in the corner, his white Stratocaster across his lap, but his hands weren't moving. He was staring at the wall, or maybe through it, his eyes unfocused. Mitch asked him something, twice, and Jimi didn't respond. It wasn't until Noel walked over and touched his shoulder that Jimi seemed to come back, blinking slowly like someone waking from a dream they couldn't quite shake. The first few songs went fine. Stone Free opened with its familiar riff, and the crowd responded with polite but genuine applause. Jimmy's fingers moved across the fretboard with the muscle memory of 1,000 performances, but something was off. His timing was a half-second behind, his solos lacked the fire they usually carried, and his voice, when he sang, sounded thin and distant, like it was coming from another room. Mitch tried to compensate, pushing the tempo, but Jimmy didn't follow. He just kept playing, mechanically, like a man going through motions he no longer believed in. And then, midway through "Hey Joe," Jimmy stopped. Not a dramatic stop, not a stage trick, just a quiet cessation of sound. His hands fell away from the strings, and he stood there, the guitar hanging from his shoulder, staring out into the audience. The silence stretched for 5 seconds, then 10, then 15. Mitch kept the beat going for a moment, confused, then he stopped too. Noel looked over, concern flashing across his face. The audience, unsure if this was part of the show, waited. Jimmy turned around slowly, walked to the back of the stage, and set his guitar down on the amplifier with a care that seemed almost ceremonial. Then he walked off. No words, no explanation, just gone. Mitch and Noel stood frozen, looking at each other, then out at the crowd, then backstage where Jimmy had disappeared. The house lights came up awkwardly, and an announcer's voice, confused and apologetic, informed the audience that the performance had concluded. Some people booed, others sat in stunned silence, but most just gathered their coats and filed out into the frozen Stockholm night, unsure what they had just witnessed. Backstage, the tour manager found Jimmy sitting on the floor of a storage closet, his back against the wall, knees pulled up to his chest. He wasn't crying, wasn't angry, just sitting there in the dark, breathing slowly. The tour manager asked what happened, if he was sick, if he needed a doctor. Jimmy shook his head. He said he just couldn't do it anymore, not tonight, maybe not ever. The tour manager, panicking about refunds and promoter relationships and the logistics of a cancelled show, tried to reason with him, but Jimmy just closed his eyes and asked to be left alone. What no one knew at the time, what wouldn't come to light until decades later, was that earlier that day Jimmy had received a phone call in his hotel room. The details of that call were never fully disclosed, but people close to Jimmy later pieced together fragments. It was from someone in management, possibly Michael Jeffrey, his co-manager, a man with a reputation for aggressive business tactics and connections that made even other industry veterans uncomfortable. The call was about money, about commitments, about the tour schedule that had already been extended twice and couldn't be cancelled without massive financial penalties. Jimmy tried to explain that he was exhausted, that he needed time, that the music was suffering, but the voice on the other end made it clear, the contracts were binding, the money had been spent, and there was no way out. Jimi Hendrix, the man who could command a stage in front of 100,000 people, hung up that phone feeling more trapped than he had ever felt in his life. The walls of that Stockholm hotel room seemed to close in, and for the first time he understood with brutal clarity that his music, the thing he loved more than anything, had become a commodity that other people owned. He didn't own his songs, didn't own his schedule, didn't even fully own the right to say no. He was 25 years old, one of the most famous musicians in the world, and he felt like a prisoner. That night's performance, or the attempt at one, was the breaking point. The moment Jimmy walked off that stage, something fundamental shifted. He had always been able to push through, to summon the energy, to deliver, but in that instant his body simply refused. It wasn't a conscious decision, it was a collapse, a system shutting down because it had been asked to run on empty for too long. The Swedish press covered the incident briefly, calling it a disappointing performance and speculating about illness or exhaustion. The tour continued, with the next show rescheduled and Jimmy back on stage a few days later, smiling for the cameras, playing the hits, doing what was expected. But people who knew him well noticed the change. He was quieter, more withdrawn, and his eyes had a faraway quality that hadn't been there before. In interviews from that period, you can see it, the way his answers trail off mid-sentence, the way he seems to be looking past the interviewer at something they can't see. And then there was the tape. In 2003, a Swedish audio engineer named Lars Gustafsson was sorting through old recordings in a Stockholm studio archive when he found a reel-to-reel labeled Hendrix, Konserthuset, January 68, incomplete. He threaded the tape onto a player, not expecting much, and heard something that made him stop cold. It was the audio from that night, the full performance, including the long silence after Jimi stopped playing. But there was something else on the tape, something recorded during soundcheck hours before the show. Jimi's voice, alone, unaccompanied by instruments, speaking into a microphone that someone had left running. His words were fragmented, almost stream of consciousness, as if he were talking to himself, working through something out loud. He spoke about his mother, about how he used to think music would save him, about how now it felt like the thing slowly erasing him. He said he didn't recognize himself anymore, that when he looked in the mirror he saw someone performing the role of Jimi Hendrix but couldn't find the person underneath. And then, just before the recording cut off, he said something that still echoes, "If I can't play for myself anymore, what's the point of playing at all?" Lars Gustafsson debated for months whether to release the tape. It felt invasive, like reading someone's private diary, but he also felt the public deserved to know that the man they idolized had been suffering in ways no one fully acknowledged while he was alive. He eventually shared segments with a documentary filmmaker, and in 2005, excerpts were broadcast for the first time. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Fans who had only known the myth of Jimi Hendrix, the untouchable guitar god, suddenly had to confront the reality of a young man drowning under expectations he never asked for. The Stockholm concert became a turning point in how people understood Jimi's final years. It wasn't just about the drugs, though they played a role. It wasn't just about bad management, though that was certainly a factor. It was about a system that took someone with extraordinary talent and squeezed every drop of value out of them without considering what it cost. Jimi gave the world some of the most innovative, boundary-pushing music ever recorded, and in return, the world demanded more, faster, louder, without pause, until there was nothing left. In the 2.5 years between that Stockholm night and his death in September 1970, Jimi tried multiple times to step back, to renegotiate his contracts, to take control of his career. He spoke about starting his own studio, about working with jazz musicians, about moving away from the spectacle and back toward the music itself. But the machinery around him was too big, the financial obligations too deep, and the people who held the contracts too invested in keeping things exactly as they were. When Jimi died in a London apartment at age 27, choking on his own vomit after mixing wine and sleeping pills, the official narrative was one of tragic excess, another rock star who burned too bright and too fast. But those who were paying attention saw something else. They saw a man who had been asking for help, in his own quiet way, for years. The unfinished concerts, the cancelled sessions, the interviews where he seemed lost, they were all signals, flares sent up from someone sinking, hoping someone would notice. Today, more than 5 decades later, the legacy of Jimi Hendrix is complicated. His music remains revolutionary, inspiring generations of guitarists who hear in his solos a kind of freedom they aspire to. But his story also serves as a warning, a reminder that talent and fame are not shields against exploitation, that contracts signed in hope can become chains, and that the industry built around music often cares more about the product than the person creating it. The concert Jimi couldn't finish in Stockholm wasn't an anomaly. It was a moment of truth, a rare instance where the mask slipped and the world saw, even if only for 18 minutes, the human cost of genius. The note found years later in his hotel room, written on Konserthuset stationery, contained just one line in Jimi's handwriting: "I want to play, but not like this." That sentence holds everything: the love, the exhaustion, the trapped feeling of being owned by something you created. Jimi Hendrix gave the world a new language for the guitar, and in return, the world took everything he had. The concert he couldn't finish was the moment he tried, however briefly, to say no, to reclaim something of himself, to stop performing and just exist. It didn't last, because the system doesn't allow for that, but for those 18 minutes in a cold Swedish concert hall, Jimi Hendrix chose himself, and perhaps that's the real legacy of that night, the secret no one wanted told, that sometimes walking away is the bravest thing an artist can do.